The grandfather clock chimed sharply as the quiet air of Edward Banks's estate was shattered by a single, raised voice. "You're accusing me of stealing?" Clara Green's voice shook, her face a mix of anger and hurt. "After all these years?" Edward Banks, a man known for his cold pragmatism and towering authority, crossed his arms as he stood before her. His gaze was icy, eyes narrowed in suspicion, as if he couldn't fathom any other explanation. "I don't see another way to explain it, Clara. The bracelet disappeared, and you were the last person in my study that evening. Do you think I don't notice these things?" Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. She'd worked for Edward for over a decade, first as a housekeeper and eventually as a trusted overseer of the household. She had been there through his business triumphs and bitter divorces, his bouts of loneliness and rare moments of joy. And yet here they were, all those years reduced to one ugly accusation over a missing bracelet. "Mr. Banks, I would never do such a thing," she said, her voice barely hiding the tremor of hurt. "I'm telling you, I have no idea where that bracelet went. I've worked here faithfully, devotedly." "Enough." Edward cut her off, his voice rising. "I gave you every comfort, trusted you with every corner of my home, and yet this is how you repay me?" Clara clenched her fists, willing herself to keep her composure. She had always known that Edward Banks was a man who valued loyalty, but he valued control even more. And if he felt that control slipping, he became ruthless. "This isn't about the bracelet, is it?" she said, unable to hold back. "You need someone to blame, someone close to you, because it's easier than looking at yourself. You've changed, Edward." Edward's jaw tightened. For a second, a flicker of uncertainty passed across his face, but it quickly vanished. He gestured sharply toward the grand doorway. "I won't stand here and listen to this. If you can't respect my home and my possessions, you have no place here." The finality of his words hung in the air like an echo. Clara's heart pounded, and she felt the weight of years of dedication crumble under the blow. In his eyes, she had gone from a trusted employee to an expendable suspect with a single accusation. "I see," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of seeing her broken. "You'll regret this, Edward. One day, you'll understand what it feels like to be judged and cast aside without a second thought." Edward remained silent, his expression unreadable. Clara turned, her back straight, and walked out of the room with her head held high. She gathered her belongings and exited the estate without another word, leaving the grand mansion and its cold owner behind her. In the silence that followed, Edward barely noticed the strange feeling of emptiness that lingered after she left. The next morning, Edward Banks sipped his coffee, staring absently through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his mansion. The sprawling estate was awash in early sunlight, but the usual satisfaction he felt in the quiet beauty of his property was curiously absent. He caught himself thinking about the argument with Clara from the previous night, a twinge of regret surfacing as he recalled her words. "You'll regret this, Edward," he scoffed under his breath, shaking off the unwelcome doubt. She was just an employee. Employees came and went. He had done what he needed to do. As he flipped through the morning paper, a headline in the society section nearly made him spill his coffee. "Mysterious heiress inherits fortune. Clara Green, former housekeeper, claims massive estate from estranged aunt." Edward blinked, certain he'd misread. But there it was, Clara's name in bold type, right beneath a formal photo of her, standing in a stately, somber office, shaking hands with a lawyer. He frowned, pulling the paper closer. He hadn't known Clara had any family, much less a wealthy aunt with an estate large enough to make headlines. The article described how Clara's distant aunt, a reclusive widow named Judith Elmore, had passed away without children, leaving her vast fortune to Clara. The estate included a sizable sum in investments, an impressive art collection, and a palatial property on the coast. A photo on the opposite page showed the estate's grand white columns and manicured gardens, which rivaled even his own. But what shocked Edward most was the number attached to the inheritance, nearly $100 million. He reread the number, mouth agape. The article explained that the inheritance had only come to light recently due to the complexity of Ms. Elmore's will, as she'd never publicly revealed her wealth or her next of kin. Clara had reportedly known very little about her aunt, having lost contact with her mother's side of the family years before. An uncomfortable twist of envy coiled in Edward's chest. Clara, his housekeeper, was now wealthier than many of his affluent business partners. The irony was as unsettling as it was humiliating. She'd left his estate in a plain car with a single suitcase, and now she could afford to buy any luxury he possessed and more. As Edward's mind reeled, his phone buzzed insistently on the table. He answered, trying to gather himself, but his assistant, Grace, was nearly incoherent with excitement on the other end. "Mr. Banks, did you see the news? About Clara?" "Yes, I saw," Edward replied curtly. "Everyone's talking about it," Grace continued. "They're calling her the Cinderella heiress. And there's more. A gala in her honor is planned for next week at the Elmore estate. They say the city's elite are invited. Should I RSVP for you?" Edward paused, unable to mask the surprise in his voice. "You're saying Clara is hosting?" "Yes, sir," Grace confirmed, clearly relishing the gossip. "It's supposed to be the social event of the year. Only the top tier are invited." Her tone grew hesitant. Apparently, she's choosing her guest list very carefully. "Cancel any other appointments that night," he said abruptly. "I'll be attending." He ended the call, feeling as though he'd been thrust into an alternate reality. The image of Clara from the article lingered in his mind. Gone was the familiar uniform, the plain attire of his housekeeper. Instead, he saw a poised, sophisticated woman with a new air of authority. It struck him that perhaps he had never really known Clara Green at all. Edward spent the days leading up to the gala in an uncharacteristic state of restlessness. Despite the unshakable confidence he'd built over his years as a powerful real estate magnate, he found himself unnerved by Clara's sudden rise to wealth and social status. The memory of their final conversation gnawed at him, Clara's words lingering like a whisper that wouldn't leave him alone. "You'll regret this, Edward." He pushed the thought aside, but it returned each time he recalled her face on the news. The world had quickly become infatuated with the story of the Cinderella heiress, the once humble housekeeper now transformed into a poised figure who held more fortune than most could imagine. Headlines praised her newfound wealth, while articles speculated about how she might wield her influence in the city's elite circles. For the first time in years, Edward couldn't concentrate on his work. Sitting in his office, surrounded by towering piles of documents and contracts that once fueled his ambition, he found himself staring blankly at Clara's name as it reappeared in article after article. Her story had even piqued the interest of several journalists from business publications, marveling at her transformation. It was as if Clara had stepped into a different world overnight, a world he had never anticipated for her. One evening, Edward sat alone in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey. The mansion felt unusually empty, and it wasn't just because of Clara's absence. The quiet seemed to echo his doubts, as if the walls themselves were questioning him. The bracelet he'd accused Clara of stealing had turned up, of course, only a day after he'd fired her. It had slipped behind a drawer in his bedroom, an ironic twist that only deepened his unease. He could feel his conscience weighing on him, challenging the ruthless streak he'd relied on for so long. A knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Grace, his assistant, entered, her gaze slightly wary. "Mr. Banks, I thought you'd want to know that Clara's gala invitation arrived," she said, holding out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was delivered by a courier, hand-delivered to only the most important people in town, apparently. Edward took the envelope, running his fingers over the gold-embossed script on the front. "Edward Banks," it read in elegant, flowing handwriting. Grace lingered, watching him carefully, and he could tell she was wondering how he felt about all this. But her curiosity only added to his irritation. "That will be all, Grace," he said curtly, dismissing her. She nodded, closing the door quietly behind her. Alone again, Edward took a deep breath and opened the envelope. The invitation was even more opulent than he'd imagined. The gala was to be held at Clara's new estate, the sprawling coastal mansion her aunt had left her. He imagined the luxury and grandeur of the place, surpassing even his own estate. It was a painful reminder that Clara was now his social equal, if not superior. How quickly fortunes change, he mused darkly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. But it wasn't just her wealth that unsettled him. It was the way Clara had become a mystery, a riddle that defied his attempts to neatly categorize her as just another employee, another person beneath his notice. She'd been right. He'd acted out of fear, anger, and a need for control. And in doing so, he had driven her away. What had he seen when he'd looked at her, really? A capable worker, a presence in the house he'd taken for granted. But now, Edward found himself reconsidering every interaction they'd ever had, wondering if he'd misjudged her all along. Clara had not only known him well, she had been privy to his moods, his doubts, and his frustrations in ways no one else had. And he had thrown that loyalty away, assuming she would fade into obscurity after he cast her out. The regret that stirred in him was unfamiliar. Edward Banks was not a man who apologized, nor a man who second-guessed his actions. But something about the magnitude of this mistake haunted him in a way no business deal or personal fallout ever had. Sighing, he took another drink and leaned back, letting his mind wander. He remembered a time years ago when Clara had come into his office to bring him tea, a small gesture he'd hardly noticed. He hadn't thanked her, nor had he realized that she'd done it simply because she'd seen how exhausted he was. Looking back, it was one of countless moments he'd dismissed without a second thought, oblivious to the subtle kindness she'd offered. In the days that followed, Edward remained a ghost in his own mansion. His staff moved around him with silent efficiency, but he no longer felt the same satisfaction from their deference. Clara had been different, more than he'd ever cared to admit. The gala, he realized, was not just an invitation to celebrate her success. It was an opportunity, a rare chance to set things right, if that was even possible. With a heavy sigh, he closed his eyes. The words on her invitation burned into his mind. "Join me to celebrate new beginnings." He couldn't shake the feeling that these new beginnings extended to both of them, and for once, Edward wasn't sure what the future would hold. The night of the gala arrived, and Edward found himself more apprehensive than he had been in years. Dressed in a custom-tailored black tuxedo, he glanced at himself in the mirror, barely recognizing the man staring back at him. For once, his confidence felt like an ill-fitting suit, awkward and out of place. Clara's invitation had seemed straightforward, but something in her phrasing, something in the words "new beginnings," lingered in his mind like a quiet warning. The driver pulled up to the Elmore estate just as twilight descended, casting a soft glow over the mansion. Guests were arriving in droves, greeted by a grand staircase flanked by elegantly dressed attendants. The estate itself was breathtaking. Tall marble pillars framed the grand entrance, with sweeping terraces and expansive gardens spilling out in every direction. It was a vision of wealth and elegance, leaving Edward with a sense of awe tinged with the bitter sting of envy. As he stepped out of his car and joined the throngs of elite guests, he realized that every face he recognized carried a similar expression of disbelief. This was Clara's event. The woman they had known as a mere housekeeper now held the reins to a fortune that could rival any of theirs. And it was her, not Edward, who was drawing the respect and admiration of their circle tonight. Inside, the ballroom was a masterclass in understated elegance, adorned with crystal chandeliers, soft candlelight, and a muted color scheme that exuded timeless sophistication. Edward noticed that Clara had spared no expense, yet there was an artful restraint to the decor, a quiet statement that seemed to say she wasn't flaunting her new status, but embracing it with dignity. Then, he saw her. Clara stood near the center of the room, surrounded by a group of admirers. She wore a floor-length emerald green gown, the color deep and rich against her fair skin, her hair swept up in a graceful twist. She looked radiant, regal even, and Edward felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Was it regret, admiration, or envy? As if sensing his gaze, Clara's eyes met his across the crowded room. For a moment, the noise and bustle faded, leaving just the two of them locked in a silent, charged stare. There was no anger or resentment in her gaze. Instead, it held a calm confidence, a knowing glint that unsettled him more than any display of bitterness could have. Summoning his courage, Edward made his way through the crowd toward her. As he approached, the guests around her politely stepped aside, granting him an unobstructed path. When he reached her, he felt a strange tightness in his chest, an uncharacteristic nervousness that left him momentarily speechless. "Clara," he began, his voice softer than he intended, "this is quite an event. You've done well." Clara inclined her head gracefully, her smile polite but reserved. "Thank you, Mr. Banks. I wanted to make sure everyone enjoyed themselves." Her tone was formal, her expression unreadable. It was as if she were speaking to a distant acquaintance rather than the man who had, not so long ago, been the center of her professional life. Edward searched her face, hoping to see some hint of the warmth that had once marked their interactions. "I must admit, I'm impressed. It's hard to believe so much has changed in such a short time." Clara raised a brow, a faint smile touching her lips. "Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? Sometimes it's the things we overlook that hold the most value." Her words were measured, carrying a subtle weight, and Edward couldn't shake the feeling that she was speaking as much about their past as about the present. He cleared his throat, feeling the sting of her words. "I owe you an apology, Clara, for what happened. I didn't handle things well. I was wrong to accuse you. I see that now." She studied him for a moment, as if measuring the sincerity of his words. "Apologies are valuable, Mr. Banks, but I've learned that actions carry far more weight." A hint of regret colored his expression. "If there's anything I can do—" "There is, actually." She cut him off with a calm but firm tone, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that caught him off guard. "I want you to understand that my intentions tonight are not simply to flaunt my fortune. This event is about reintroducing myself to this world on my own terms. I hope you, of all people, can understand the significance of that." The words landed with an unexpected force. Clara wasn't looking for forgiveness or validation. She was reclaiming her narrative, rewriting the story Edward had assumed would be hers forever. That of the loyal, invisible housekeeper, the woman who quietly faded into the background of his life. Tonight, she stood tall, unflinching, a symbol of strength and self-determination. He nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. "You've always been remarkable, Clara. I just didn't see it before." Clara's gaze softened, though only slightly. "Sometimes, Mr. Banks, it takes losing something to realize its true worth." Just as she spoke, a man in a crisp suit approached, bowing slightly to her. "Miss Green, may I introduce you to Mr. Harrington? He's been waiting to discuss a potential partnership with you." Clara gave a gracious nod to the man before glancing back at Edward. "If you'll excuse me, I have some business matters to attend to. Enjoy the rest of the evening, Mr. Banks." She turned and walked away, leaving Edward feeling as if he'd been dismissed, a feeling entirely foreign to him. As he watched her disappear into the crowd, her new circle of admirers and potential partners flocking around her, he realized that the power dynamic between them had shifted irreversibly. It dawned on him that Clara wasn't just hosting a gala. She was carving out a new position for herself in their world, a place that had once belonged solely to him. And for the first time, he understood that his role in her life was no longer one of authority but of distant reverence. Edward spent the rest of the evening mingling with other guests, but his mind remained fixated on Clara and the strange, transformative path she had taken. He watched her from a distance as she moved through the crowd with a grace and poise he'd never imagined she possessed. Clara was no longer the quiet housekeeper he remembered. She was the center of attention, and she wore her newfound power effortlessly. As the evening wore on, Edward felt an unyielding urge to speak with her again. An hour passed, and he finally found a moment when she was alone, admiring a painting in the corner of the gallery. Edward approached quietly, his footsteps muted by the plush carpet. "Impressive collection," he said, glancing at the painting she was studying. A serene landscape bathed in golden light. She turned to him, her expression neutral. "Yes, my aunt was very particular about her art. She spent years curating pieces that spoke to her, though I suspect they meant something different to her than they do to me." He nodded, noticing the way she kept her tone polite but distant. It felt as if there was an invisible wall between them, one that he hadn't fully anticipated. He took a deep breath, deciding to push past the small talk. Clara, I came here tonight hoping we could have an honest conversation, beyond pleasantries. She regarded him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Honest conversations can be dangerous, Mr. Banks. They bring things to light that many prefer to keep hidden. Edward hesitated, sensing the depth of her words. He wanted to bridge the chasm between them, but he felt off balance, vulnerable. Finally, he spoke. I realize now how poorly I treated you that night. I was wrong. The bracelet had been misplaced, and I jumped to conclusions without thinking. Clara's face softened just slightly, but her gaze remained steady. I spent years working for you, Mr. Banks. I was there for you when you needed someone, even when you barely noticed. And in one night, you erased all of that because of a single accusation. Edward winced, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily on him. I know, Clara, and I'm truly sorry for it. But it was more than just an accusation, wasn't it? There was something else between us. I may not have acknowledged it, but I valued you. Clara's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, perhaps pain or remembrance, flashed in her eyes. You valued me in a way that made me invisible. I was useful to you as long as I stayed within the role you'd cast for me. But the moment I was anything more, you saw me as a threat, as someone who didn't belong. Edward swallowed, the sting of her words cutting deeper than he expected. She was right. He had seen her as an extension of his life, an employee who made things easier, smoother. But he'd never considered her as a person with dreams, dignity, and worth outside of what she did for him. I didn't know you felt this way, he admitted quietly, hating the vulnerability that seeped into his voice. I suppose I never asked. She let out a small, bitter laugh. No, you didn't. But I didn't expect you to, not then. She looked at him with a steadiness that left him feeling bare, as if she could see past his carefully cultivated image. Tell me, Mr. Banks, what is it that you want from me now? The question threw him off balance. What did he want? Was it forgiveness, an understanding, or simply a glimpse into the heart of the woman he had wronged? I don't know, he said, feeling strangely exposed. Maybe I came here looking for closure, or perhaps a way to start over, somehow. Clara's gaze softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. Closure isn't something you can ask for. It's something you earn. And starting over, she paused, taking a measured breath. Starting over requires both sides to agree to it, and I'm no longer sure we see the world the same way. Her words struck him like a quiet revelation. Clara was not just rebuffing him. She was asserting a truth he'd long overlooked. She didn't need his validation or his forgiveness. She had found strength in her own journey, one that no longer required his approval or involvement. Clara gave him a small, sad smile. This gala, my inheritance, everything you see here. It isn't about proving myself to you or anyone else. It's about reclaiming my life on my own terms. I'm no longer the woman you remember, Edward, nor am I interested in being that woman again. Her words left him feeling hollow, an ache he hadn't anticipated swelling within him. He nodded, understanding at last that he was not the one in control of this conversation, or of their story. Then, if nothing else, he said quietly, I hope you find what you're looking for, Clara. And I hope you'll let me make amends in some way, if there's ever a way for me to do so. Clara gave him a long, considering look. Thank you, Edward. But my journey forward is mine alone now. Just then, the MC took the stage to announce that the auction would soon begin, a charity event in honor of Clara's aunt, with all proceeds going to causes she championed. Clara excused herself, turning toward the stage, and Edward watched her go, feeling the finality of her departure settle over him like a quiet resignation. As the crowd began to gather for the auction, Edward remained where he was, struck by the realization that he had lost something valuable, something he hadn't even known he wanted. For the first time, he felt as if he were on the outside looking in, no longer the powerful man commanding attention, but merely a spectator in the life of someone who had outgrown him. And as the applause rang out for Clara, who stood elegantly on stage, he understood fully. The woman he had taken for granted was now beyond his reach. The days following the gala left Edward restless. He tried to throw himself back into his work, but every time he opened a file or sat down for a meeting, his mind drifted back to Clara's poised, composed figure on that stage. Despite his best efforts, her words haunted him. "I'm no longer the woman you remember. My journey forward is mine alone now." And yet, there was an undeniable tension in her last glance, a hint of something unspoken. He couldn't shake the feeling that she had intentionally left him with questions unanswered, as though daring him to discover the truth. Late one evening, Edward found himself in his office, alone, unable to sleep. A quick search through his archives had led him to several old documents connected to his business dealings with the Elmore estate, the very fortune Clara had inherited. He pored over faded paperwork, contracts, and deeds in the dim light, piecing together a puzzle that had been forming ever since her gala. Then he found it. In a contract dating back nearly 2 decades, Edward's company had negotiated with Judith Elmore, Clara's late aunt, for development rights on a massive tract of land. The deal had never gone through, and he remembered why. Judith Elmore had been famously obstinate, refusing to allow any of her land to be repurposed for commercial use. Edward had moved on, chalking it up to a missed opportunity. But it seemed there was more to the story. Reading further, he found a letter from his old business partner, Michael Harrington, who had tried to broker the deal on Edward's behalf. The letter was curt, with an ominous undertone. "The Elmore family's influence runs deep, and I suspect it's best to leave this one alone. They hold certain knowledge about our business that could become problematic." Edward frowned, feeling a prick of unease. He had long ago dismissed Harrington's words as the nervous ramblings of a cautious man. But now he wondered what secrets Judith Elmore had held, and whether Clara had inherited more than just her wealth. A sudden desire to uncover the truth spurred him to action. He pulled out his phone and dialed his private investigator, a man who discreetly handled matters for him in the past. Within minutes, he had arranged a background check, requesting details on both Judith Elmore and any connection she may have had to his business. 2 days later, the investigator's report arrived, and what Edward found left him stunned. The Elmore family, as it turned out, had deep roots not only in real estate but also in uncovering corrupt dealings among powerful business moguls in the city. Dealings that, in the past, had occasionally intersected with Edward's own. Judith Elmore had quietly funded investigations into unethical practices by corporations, lobbying groups, and individual businessmen, exposing a series of scandals over the years. She had done it all from behind the scenes, using her wealth as a tool to wield influence without ever stepping into the limelight. And now, all of that influence was in Clara's hands. Edward sat back, feeling an icy chill settle over him. Clara's inheritance wasn't just a matter of wealth, it was a weapon, and one she could wield to bring down anyone whose practices conflicted with the ethical standards Judith had upheld. If Clara chose to follow in her aunt's footsteps, she could make his life, and the lives of his associates, a nightmare. He realized now that her gaze at the gala had held a quiet promise, a promise of power and accountability, wrapped in the grace of a woman he'd once dismissed. Unable to ignore the rising anxiety, Edward decided to confront her directly. He sent her a message, requesting a private meeting. After a tense day of waiting, her response arrived, a single line agreeing to meet at a cafe in a quiet, upscale part of the city. The next afternoon, Edward entered the cafe, spotting Clara seated by a window overlooking a small garden. She looked calm, almost serene, with an expression that revealed nothing of the fire she'd ignited in his world. Edward joined her, struggling to maintain his composure. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said, choosing his words carefully. Clara nodded, sipping her tea. "I suspected you'd want to talk. It was only a matter of time." Edward took a steadying breath, deciding to approach the matter head-on. "Clara, I have to ask, what are your intentions with this inheritance?" Clara's eyes glimmered with a faint amusement, and she set her cup down carefully. "Intentions? I'm not sure I understand, Mr. Banks. My intentions are to honor my aunt's legacy." Edward's jaw tightened at her evasion, and he leaned forward. "Judith Elmore's legacy was more than wealth, Clara. I know she was involved in other matters. Matters that could affect people like me. Clara raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. Oh? And why would that concern you, Mr. Banks? Her question cut him deeply, forcing him to acknowledge what he had worked hard to deny, that his business dealings had not always been above reproach. He had skirted the edges of legality, made ruthless choices in the name of success. Choices that, if scrutinized under a powerful enough lens, could destroy his reputation. You know exactly why, he replied, trying to hold on to his composure. I want to know if you're planning to use your new position to investigate me, or others who were close to me. Clara tilted her head, considering him. If that's what keeps you up at night, perhaps there's more you should worry about than my intentions. Her words hit him like a slap, and he felt a surge of anger and defensiveness, mingled with the sting of guilt. I made mistakes, Clara. We all do in this world. But that doesn't make me a criminal. Clara's gaze softened slightly, but there was a steely resolve in her eyes. It's not about whether you're a criminal, Edward. It's about accountability. My aunt believed that wealth and power come with responsibility, and she used hers to make a difference, not to turn a blind eye. Edward's pulse quickened as he realized her true intention. Clara was no longer the woman standing quietly in the background, supporting his every whim without question. She was a force unto herself, a person who now had the means and the will to challenge men like him. What do you want from me, Clara? He asked, his voice betraying a hint of desperation. Clara considered him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she replied, I want you to look at the choices you've made and understand that every action has consequences. Wealth is not a shield to hide behind, nor a weapon to wield recklessly. It's a responsibility. Edward felt the weight of her words settle into his bones, and he realized he had come here expecting a confrontation, only to be met with a lesson. Clara wasn't out to destroy him, not directly. Instead, she was giving him a chance to reckon with his past, to face the consequences of his choices without her intervention. As she rose to leave, she gave him a final, piercing look. Consider this your warning, Edward. Don't squander it. My aunt believed people could change. I hope for your sake that she was right. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him in the quiet cafe, grappling with the weight of his own decisions. For the first time in his life, Edward felt the full burden of accountability, and the terrifying realization that redemption was a path he would have to choose for himself. In the weeks that followed his conversation with Clara, Edward felt a tension within him that refused to ease. The normally comfortable routine of his life had become unsettled, overshadowed by the quiet, pointed warning Clara had left him with. For the first time in his life, he felt like his wealth and status were liabilities rather than shields. Clara's words, her challenge to his choices, and her insistence that wealth carried responsibilities, haunted him. Every time he looked at his empire, his properties, and even his own luxurious estate, a nagging doubt surfaced. Had he built his success on a foundation of compromise, ruthlessness, and moral ambiguity? Until now, he'd always justified his actions, telling himself that business required hard choices and that success demanded sacrifice. But Clara's legacy, Judith Elmore's legacy, posed a question he could no longer ignore. At what cost? One morning, Edward arrived at his office to find his assistant, Grace, waiting with an urgent look on her face. Mr. Banks, there's something you should see, she said, holding out a financial magazine. Edward took it, his stomach tightening as he read the cover headline. The Elmore Influence, Clara Green's Commitment to Ethical Business, A New Era? Beneath the headline was a photo of Clara, poised and composed as ever, standing before a podium, addressing a crowd of prominent city leaders and business people. Edward's eyes scanned the article, which detailed Clara's recent commitment to upholding her aunt's mission, promoting transparency and ethical practices within the corporate world. She was assembling a powerful board of trustees to evaluate, support, and fund businesses that maintained rigorous standards of integrity. As he continued reading, the article made it clear that Clara's influence was already rippling through the business world. A handful of Edward's acquaintances were mentioned, men who had cut corners or bent rules to accumulate wealth and power. Clara's initiative seemed to serve as a reminder that their fortunes were not as secure as they might have once believed. Edward felt a chill settle over him. He knew how the corporate world worked, how alliances could change in a heartbeat when faced with new power dynamics. Clara's growing influence was quickly shifting the landscape, and he was uncomfortably aware that his own reputation could easily fall into her crosshairs if she chose to target him directly. An email alert pinged on his computer, interrupting his thoughts. It was from an old colleague, Harold Pierce, a wealthy real estate developer notorious for his aggressive tactics and cavalier disregard for ethics. The email was brief and pointed. "Edward, we need to discuss the Elmore situation. Meet me at the club this evening." Edward stared at the email, feeling a blend of dread and frustration. Harold's request could mean only one thing. He, too, was feeling the pressure from Clara's growing influence, and he was looking to rally allies to protect his interests. That evening, Edward entered the upscale private club where he and Harold had met countless times over the years. It was a place that had always represented power, camaraderie, and exclusivity to Edward, but tonight, the luxury and splendor of the surroundings felt hollow. Harold greeted him with a grim expression and wasted no time in getting to the point. "Edward, we're in a tight spot," he began. "Clara Green's initiative is gaining traction, and it's only a matter of time before she starts publicly scrutinizing every business deal we've made. She's gathering power, and if she decides to focus on us, she'll have enough backing to ruin everything." Edward sipped his drink, feigning a calm he didn't feel. "Harold, Clara may be positioning herself as some sort of moral arbiter, but it's all just smoke and mirrors. Business is about resilience, adaptability. We'll find a way around it." Harold scoffed, frustration evident on his face. "This isn't just business, Edward. It's personal. She's out to change the way things are done, and she's got the resources to make it happen. Do you realize what she's proposing? Transparency boards, independent audits, shareholder accountability, all the things we've been able to sidestep for years." Edward leaned back, feeling the weight of Harold's words. He knew his colleague wasn't exaggerating. Clara wasn't simply creating a ripple in the corporate world. She was stirring up a storm that could upend everything they had taken for granted. "Are you suggesting we do something about it?" Edward asked, his voice low, careful. Harold met his gaze, his expression hardening. "We're businessmen, Edward. We protect our interests. And right now, Clara Green's influence is a threat to everything we've built." Edward nodded slowly, understanding the implication. But as he sat across from Harold, the unease within him intensified. He felt trapped between two forces, his past, embodied by men like Harold, and a new, uncharted path Clara seemed to be leading him toward. Part of him recoiled at the thought of pushing back against her, of resorting to the same underhanded tactics he'd once employed without hesitation. "I'll consider it," he said finally, though even as he spoke, he knew his heart wasn't fully committed to the words. Back at his mansion that night, Edward found sleep elusive. He lay awake, thoughts racing, caught between conflicting loyalties and a mounting sense of moral reckoning. Harold's insistence echoed in his mind, but Clara's calm resolve lingered even more powerfully, her challenge urging him to confront the truth he'd long ignored. Early the next morning, Edward went for a long walk around his estate, hoping the cool dawn air would clear his mind. As he passed the meticulously maintained gardens and grand fountains, he found himself feeling strangely disenchanted with his wealth. For years, he had believed these opulent surroundings defined him, represented his legacy. But now, under the weight of Clara's unspoken judgment, they felt more like gilded bars in a cage. That afternoon, Edward made a decision. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he'd memorized by heart, the number of his private investigator. But this time, his request was different. "I need you to look into my own business dealings," he said, the words strange on his tongue. "Find any connections that might raise questions. Anything that might cast a shadow on my record. And I want the truth, no matter what you find." There was a pause on the other end of the line before the investigator replied, "Are you sure, Mr. Banks?" Edward took a deep breath. "Yes, I'm sure." As he ended the call, he felt a sense of release, as if a weight had lifted, replaced by a quiet determination. If he was going to survive the shift Clara had initiated, he needed to confront his own flaws. He could no longer hide behind the facade of success or the comfort of his wealth. For the first time, Edward found himself looking at his life from Clara's perspective, realizing that his legacy was only as valuable as the integrity it was built upon. And if he was to find a way forward, he knew he would have to confront his past head-on, no matter what it revealed. With this resolve, he stood by the window, watching the sun set over the city that had both made him and molded him, ready to begin a journey that might reshape everything he thought he knew about himself. 2 days later, Edward's investigator returned with a thick envelope, a collection of reports he had requested on his own business dealings over the years. Edward accepted the envelope, his fingers hovering over the seal, reluctant yet driven by the same sense of duty Clara's words had instilled in him. With a sigh, he finally opened it. The documents detailed more than a few questionable deals. Zoning permits achieved through quiet bribery, property acquisitions that had displaced families, and several instances of labor underpayment, all tactics he'd justified in the name of success. The investigator had also uncovered a scandalous business decision that, had it been made public, would have jeopardized his entire empire. Edward's stomach turned as he read through the records, realizing that the moral compromises he'd made had accumulated into a far darker legacy than he'd ever admitted. Edward spent hours reviewing his past, feeling every blow as he came face to face with his own choices. These were his decisions, and no matter how much he'd rationalized them, he was no longer certain he could continue down this path. Clara's influence had stirred something within him, a desire to break free from the weight of his mistakes. But how? The answer arrived in an unexpected form. Late one evening, as Edward was sitting in his study, his phone buzzed. To his surprise, it was Clara. The message was brief. "Come by the estate tomorrow morning. There's something we need to discuss." Edward's heart raced. Was she about to confront him? Perhaps she'd already uncovered the very information he'd just spent hours agonizing over. He didn't sleep well that night, plagued by visions of his life unraveling, his reputation tarnished, and his empire dismantled piece by piece. By the time dawn broke, he was dressed and ready, anxiety simmering beneath his polished exterior. Clara's estate looked even more impressive by daylight. As Edward arrived at the front entrance, he was met by a housekeeper who led him through the opulent hallways, adorned with art and artifacts reflecting her aunt's legacy. Finally, he was shown into a private sitting room, where Clara awaited him. She looked composed as ever, a quiet strength radiating from her as she motioned for him to sit. "Thank you for coming," Clara began, her tone neutral, revealing nothing of the purpose behind her invitation. Edward settled into the chair across from her, his heart pounding. "You said there was something we needed to discuss?" Clara nodded, clasping her hands in her lap. "I wanted to speak with you about the Elmore estate and its holdings. There's a specific piece of property that recently came to my attention, one that your company has had a long-standing interest in." Edward's pulse quickened. He knew exactly which property she was referring to. It was a prime location near the coast, a piece of land that could yield enormous profits. His company had tried and failed to acquire it multiple times over the years due to Judith Elmore's unwavering refusal to sell. "Yes, I know the property," he replied carefully, wary of where this conversation might lead. Clara tilted her head, studying him intently. "I was reviewing my aunt's records, and I found that she had received multiple offers from your firm over the years, including a particularly aggressive offer about 10 years ago. Do you remember that?" Edward nodded, though his throat felt dry. "Yes, I recall. It was a valuable asset, and I believed it would be beneficial to both parties." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. "Beneficial, perhaps, but not to the people who lived on that land. My aunt was adamant about preserving it, and now I understand why. That land holds significance not only to the local community, but also to the families who have called it home for generations." Edward shifted uncomfortably. He had always viewed the property as just another business venture, never once considering its impact on the lives connected to it. But under Clara's steady gaze, he felt the weight of his past perspective. "I see," he replied, struggling to maintain his composure. "Are you planning to sell?" Clara's gaze softened, and he felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. "No, Edward, I'm not selling. I'm going to restore that land as a sanctuary, a place for the community to gather and celebrate their heritage." Her voice was steady, filled with conviction. My aunt was committed to more than just wealth. She believed in preserving legacies, in ensuring that prosperity extended beyond just the wealthy few. Edward swallowed, feeling a swell of respect for her. She had not only inherited Judith's wealth, but had absorbed her values, her determination to protect what mattered. "I came here today prepared to offer you an apology," he admitted, his voice low, weighted by sincerity. "I've realized there are things I've done that don't align with the principles you're standing for. Clara, I want to change." Her eyes softened further, though she maintained her poise. "I can see that, Edward. But change is a choice you must make every day. It's not enough to simply regret the past. You have to actively seek ways to make amends." Edward nodded, absorbing her words. "I don't know where to start." A small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. "I think you've already begun, by acknowledging your mistakes. But if you're serious, there are ways to use your influence for good, ways that don't compromise your integrity or harm others. You have resources and connections that could be used to improve communities, support ethical business practices, and give back." The idea was daunting but invigorating. For years, Edward had defined success as amassing wealth and power, expanding his empire without concern for the consequences. But Clara was offering him a vision of something greater, something that resonated with a part of him he'd ignored for too long. "How can I be certain I won't fall back into old patterns?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of vulnerability. Clara regarded him with a thoughtful expression. "Integrity is a choice, Edward. It's not about being perfect. It's about striving to do better every day. I think you'll find that once you start down this path, it becomes easier to stay true to it." He nodded slowly, feeling a newfound sense of purpose forming within him. "Thank you, Clara. For the first time, I feel like I have something worth working toward beyond my own gain." Clara smiled, a genuine, warm smile that seemed to light up the room. "Then consider this a second chance. We don't often get them, but when we do, they're worth everything." They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Edward felt as though he were standing at a crossroads, with Clara guiding him toward a path he had never dared to explore. It was a path of redemption, of accountability, and of using his wealth for something meaningful. As he rose to leave, Clara extended her hand. He took it, and the handshake held a promise, a commitment to the change he had pledged to pursue. Stepping out of the estate, Edward felt a lightness he hadn't known in years. The burden of his past mistakes remained, but it was now tempered by a sense of hope, a belief that he could, perhaps, redefine his legacy. Clara had given him a gift far more valuable than any property or business opportunity. She had given him the chance to reclaim his own integrity. As he walked back to his car, he looked over the sweeping gardens and grand facade of the estate and knew that he had left a different man than the one who had arrived. The journey ahead would be difficult, requiring every ounce of the courage and resolve he'd once invested solely in his business pursuits. But with Clara's words echoing in his mind, he felt ready for it. He would not waste this second chance. As the days passed, Edward found himself embracing the commitment he'd made to change, yet the road forward was rougher than he'd anticipated. Transitioning from a life of power-driven ambition to one of accountability and ethical responsibility was a challenge that tested him at every turn. And though he found a strange satisfaction in his efforts, he soon discovered that not everyone around him shared his newfound principles. Word of Edward's shift in values traveled quickly, sparking curiosity and concern among his old business associates. Some applauded him privately, commending his courage to reform, but others, like Harold Pierce, were far less pleased. Harold had been blunt about his disapproval from the start, calling Edward's change of heart a liability to their collective interests. One evening, Harold called, his voice tense with frustration. "Edward, we need to talk now. Meet me at the club. I won't take no for an answer." Edward hesitated, feeling a pang of dread at the thought of facing Harold. But he agreed, understanding that he could no longer avoid the confrontation that had been building between them. Arriving at the club, Edward found Harold waiting in a private room, his expression one of steely impatience. "Edward," Harold said curtly as he entered, "I'll get right to the point. I've had enough of this sudden moral crusade you're on. It's disrupting business. Do you understand that?" Edward took a seat, meeting Harold's gaze with calm determination. "Harold, I've come to realize that there's more to success than profit. I can't ignore the impact my actions have had on others anymore." Harold scoffed, his face darkening with anger. "This is about that woman, isn't it? Clara Green. Ever since she came into her inheritance, she's been preaching ethics and transparency, and somehow, you're letting her turn you against everything we've worked for. Do you even know what you're risking?" Edward felt a wave of anger rise within him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Clara isn't responsible for my choices, Harold. I've made this decision because it's the right thing to do. The empire I built, it's one I can barely look at with pride anymore." Harold leaned forward, his eyes cold and unyielding. "We all make compromises, Edward. You think you can just wash your hands of it? Turn your back on the years we've spent building this legacy? You'll ruin us both with this sudden honor you've decided to find." But Edward was unmoved. "My decision isn't going to change, Harold. I know the path I'm choosing is risky, but I'd rather rebuild on honesty than continue with this charade. And frankly, if that means some people don't stand with me, then so be it." Harold's expression turned livid, and he slammed his fist onto the table, the noise reverberating in the room. "I won't let you bring me down with you, Edward. I have everything to lose." "That's your choice, Harold," Edward replied quietly, "but I can't ignore the harm our actions have caused." For a long, tense moment, Harold stared at him, his eyes filled with an unreadable intensity. Then he spoke, his voice laced with bitterness. "If that's how it is, Edward, then you're no ally of mine. I'll make sure that when you fall alone." Edward watched him storm out, a weight settling in his chest. The confrontation had been inevitable, but it was harder than he'd anticipated. He had severed a partnership that had once defined his career, and he knew Harold would follow through on his threat to undermine him. But the resolve that Clara had inspired within him was stronger than ever. No matter the cost, he would not turn back. A few days later, Edward received an invitation to a charity gala, a project Clara had initiated to benefit underfunded community programs. Determined to support her mission, he attended the event with an open mind and heart, embracing the purpose behind it. Arriving at the gala, Edward found Clara effortlessly moving through the crowd, warmly greeting guests, many of whom were prominent community figures. The impact of her aunt's legacy was evident everywhere, from the diversity of attendees to the thoughtful design of the event itself. Edward watched her, admiring her grace and conviction. Finally, he made his way over to her, and she greeted him with a warm smile. "Edward, I'm glad you came." "Thank you, Clara," he replied, his voice genuine. "I wanted to show my support for everything you're doing." They spent the evening discussing the charity's goals, the communities that would benefit, and the plans Clara had for future projects. Edward felt an ease he hadn't known in years, as though he were truly part of something greater than himself. But just as the night seemed to draw to a perfect close, a familiar, unwelcome face appeared. Harold Pierce. Harold's expression was unreadable, his gaze cold as he approached them. Clara straightened, her calm demeanor remaining intact, though Edward could sense her unease. "Clara Green," Harold said, a thin, mocking smile playing at his lips. "I must commend you on your little project here. It's quite inspiring." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "Thank you, Mr. Pierce. I'm glad you see the value in giving back." Harold let out a mirthless laugh. "Value? I suppose it has value, in its way. But what I can't understand is why Edward here has suddenly lost his sense of business for the sake of your moral crusade." Edward's jaw tightened, but Clara remained poised. "Mr. Pierce, Edward is free to choose his own path," she said evenly. "This isn't about changing anyone's business. It's about offering something meaningful to those who need it." But Harold wasn't backing down. "You think you're saving the world, don't you?" He sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Edward here is throwing away years of success. And for what? To please you? Edward finally stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. I made this choice for myself, Harold. No one else. If you can't respect that, then you're free to leave. Harold's eyes narrowed, and he gave a small, derisive chuckle. You're a fool, Edward. A fool led by a woman who's nothing more than a shadow of her aunt. I've seen too many like you, Clara. All this philanthropy, it's just a front. Clara held her ground, but Edward saw the flicker of hurt in her eyes. Anger boiled within him as he turned to Harold, his tone sharp. You're wrong, Harold. Clara's done more good in a few short months than either of us ever cared to in our entire careers. I won't let you belittle her, or what she's trying to accomplish. Harold sneered, but he turned and stormed off, his footsteps heavy with anger. Silence fell between Edward and Clara as the guests around them watched with curious glances. But Clara quickly composed herself, giving him a gentle smile. Thank you, Edward. I didn't expect you to stand up for me like that. Edward looked at her, a deep respect and admiration shining in his eyes. Clara, you've inspired me to change more than I thought possible. Standing up for you was the least I could do. She gave a small nod, her gaze softening. I can see the difference in you, Edward. It's real. And I think you'll find that the more you open yourself to this path, the more fulfilling it will be. The night resumed its celebratory tone, and Edward felt a new sense of peace and purpose within himself. As he looked around, he no longer saw the event as a means to impress or network, but as a reminder of the good he could contribute to the world. By the end of the evening, Edward knew he had truly left his old self behind. He was no longer the cold, calculating businessman of years past, but someone willing to use his resources and connections to build rather than destroy. And as he left the gala with a renewed commitment to this life of integrity and purpose, he felt a newfound strength, one rooted not in wealth or power, but in the dignity and respect he had regained. Months passed, and Edward's life began to transform in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had parted ways with many former business partners, severing ties with those who refused to adjust to the ethical standards he now upheld. The media caught wind of his dramatic shift, calling it the bank's reformation, and analysts and journalists alike speculated on whether this change would endure, or was merely a temporary whim. But Edward knew it was real, a fundamental shift inspired by Clara's influence. Edward channeled his resources into new ventures, partnering with organizations that supported sustainable housing, fair labor, and economic development in struggling communities. The impact of his philanthropy began to resonate across the city, and people who once knew him as the ruthless real estate mogul began to see him in a different light. It was a difficult transition, filled with constant self-doubt and more than a few hard-earned lessons. But with each step, Edward felt the weight of his past gradually lift. Throughout this journey, he stayed in touch with Clara. Their relationship had evolved from a tangled web of guilt and redemption into a genuine friendship rooted in mutual respect. Clara became his confidant and his mentor, guiding him through the difficult decisions and supporting him when his past mistakes threatened to catch up with him. Edward valued her insights deeply, realizing that her perspective had become a guiding force in his life. One afternoon, Edward received an unexpected invitation from Clara. She had organized a community celebration at the coastal land that once caused so much tension between them. Now fully transformed into a public sanctuary, the property featured walking paths, community gardens, and a beautiful outdoor amphitheater for local events and gatherings. Clara had named it the Elmore Legacy Park, a tribute to her aunt's memory and a celebration of her mission. Arriving at the park, Edward felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The land had taken on new life, vibrant with families, children laughing, and groups enjoying the tranquil beauty of the setting. As he walked through the park, he felt as if he were witnessing the true power of wealth when wielded responsibly, not as a means of control, but as a tool for positive change. Spotting Clara near a small crowd gathered at the amphitheater, he made his way over. She smiled warmly when she saw him, and they shared a brief embrace. "Welcome, Edward," she said, her eyes shining. "I'm glad you came." "This is incredible, Clara," he replied, marveling at the transformation around him. "You've created something meaningful." More than I could have ever imagined for this place. Clara nodded, her expression one of quiet pride. Thank you. But you're part of this too, Edward. You were one of the first people I thought of when planning this project, and you helped make it possible. He shook his head humbly. You did this, Clara. I'm just grateful to have had the chance to support something that's truly good. They walked together along the newly paved paths, exchanging stories of their past and visions for the future. Their conversation turned from business to memories, and for the first time, Edward felt a sense of belonging in her world, as if he had finally earned his place beside her. As they reached a bench overlooking the gardens, Clara turned to him, a serious look on her face. Edward, I've been meaning to tell you something. He glanced at her, curiosity piqued. What is it? Clara took a deep breath. When I inherited my aunt's fortune, I knew I'd use it to make a difference. But I also knew I needed people who shared that vision. People who would carry it forward with integrity and a commitment to doing good. I believe you're one of those people, Edward. You've proven that to me, and to yourself. Her words struck him with a mixture of pride and humility. I'm honored, Clara. I won't let you down. Clara gave a slight smile, her eyes filled with both warmth and intensity. I know you won't. That's why I want to make this official. I'd like to invite you to join the Elmore Foundation as a permanent member of our Board of Trustees. Edward blinked, momentarily speechless. The Elmore Foundation was one of the most respected philanthropic organizations in the city, known for its unwavering commitment to ethical causes. The offer was not just a position but an opportunity to leave a lasting impact, to embed himself in the legacy that Clara had championed. I don't know what to say, he managed finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Say yes, Clara replied, smiling. I know you're ready. He met her gaze, feeling the sincerity in her words resonate with everything he had worked toward. With a deep breath, he nodded. Yes, I'd be honored. The two of them sat in comfortable silence for a moment, letting the weight of the decision settle. As they watched families enjoy the park, Edward felt a satisfaction he had never known, a feeling that his life had finally found purpose beyond wealth or ambition. He wasn't just redefining his own legacy. He was becoming part of something far greater than himself. When the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Edward turned to Clara, a question lingering on his mind. Do you ever think about how different things could have been if I hadn't changed? Clara considered his question thoughtfully. Maybe things would have been different, Edward, but I believe people can transform, and sometimes it takes just one person, one act of kindness or accountability, to change the direction of a life. Edward smiled, feeling a profound gratitude for the woman beside him. You were that person for me, Clara. I don't think I ever told you just how much that means to me. She returned his smile, her voice gentle. I know, Edward, and I'm proud of you. They watched as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, leaving the park bathed in a warm, amber glow. In that moment, Edward knew he had come full circle, from a man who had once dismissed responsibility as an inconvenience, to someone who cherished it as his highest calling. As they rose to leave, Clara looped her arm through his, and they walked together back through the gardens. They had both grown through each other's influence, each having learned and transformed in ways they hadn't anticipated. And as Edward looked toward the future, he felt a calm certainty that this new path was exactly where he was meant to be. For the first time, he understood that legacy was not built in power or wealth alone, but in the kindness, respect, and integrity that outlasted a lifetime. And with Clara beside him, he was ready to leave a mark on the world that truly mattered.